different topic lined up for this week's episode. I wanted to speak about cross-border loans, but when I received SARS's legal counsel mailer on Friday afternoon, I saw that they issued an interesting ruling at the end of last week on something that comes up very often in practice. And that's the question of interest deductibility. So in short, the ruling deals with the deductibility of interest on a loan that will in future be used to redeem preference shares. So in this week's episode of Tax Break, your podcast for South African tax professionals and practitioners, I'm looking at the ruling. I'm doing a bit of a recap on when interest would be deductible. And I'm also going to talk about and share my thoughts on why I think the taxpayer felt it was necessary to apply for this ruling. So as per usual, I would like to ask you to please rate the podcast on whatever podcast platform you're listening to, and to also send the link to others who you think might also like the podcast. So the subscriber numbers are growing steadily every week. So thanks to everyone who's sharing the links and voting for the podcast. I also want to remind you, if you've got any questions or ideas, my email address is in the show notes, so you're welcome to send me an email. Back to the ruling that I referred to in the introduction. So the ruling number is Binding Private Ruling 424, and some of the key facts are the borrower is the applicant. So the borrower is an entity that's developing a project. It seems like quite a capital-intensive project, and a project that takes a while to construct. And there's the other party to the transaction is a bank that offered to provide project finance. So initially there'll be two sources of finance or funding: a senior JIBAR facility that would cover 40% of the construction costs and initial startup costs, and then redeemable preference shares that will cover the other 60%. And these redeemable preference shares will be cumulative dividends that they will accumulate over or while the preference shares are in issue. Now, the ruling doesn't explicitly say why the split was necessary between the JIBAR facility and the redeemable preference shares, but looking at the detail that is shared in the ruling, it seems like the preference shares are a bit more. The terms are a bit more lenient insofar as repayment is concerned relative to the loan. So, for example, there's a dividend grace period and things like that. Right. The plan is then, and the ruling also specifically mentions this, that the preference shares will be redeemed, and that redemption can be funded by a new loan from the same bank. So, and the ruling refers to this as the post-construction loan. Now, the new loan may be drawn down to fund A, unpaid dividends, and B, the redemption of the preference shares, the redemption amount, the capital in other words. So the ruling that SARS issued, they addressed 2 points in the ruling. Firstly, that the applicant may deduct interest under Section 24J in respect of the new loan, to the extent that the interest does not relate to the funding of the preference dividends. So to the extent that something else is that the funds are being used for something else, which would seem like it's the repayment of the capital of the preference dividend or preference shares, the interest is deductible. But to the extent that the new loan will fund the payment of the preference dividends, there is no deduction. Secondly, the ruling explicitly says that it doesn't deal with Section 8E and Section 8EA. Now, those are the provisions that relate to hybrid equity instruments, and they always come into play whenever you are looking at redeemable shares. Right, so let's go back to the law. When would interest be deductible? So for that, we look at Section 24J2. Now, that provision starts off by saying that you've got a deemed amount of interest, or an amount that's deemed to be incurred according to the timing rules of Section 24J. And then it goes on to say that this amount must be deducted from the income of that person, so in other words, the borrower, derived from carrying on a trade, if that amount is incurred in the production of income. And I suspect this is where the real issue behind the ruling is to say, but what is the purpose of the new loan? can you look back to what the preference share funding was used for and say, but that's the purpose of the loan when you apply Section 24J? Or should you just look at the closest step in the process, which is redeeming the preference share funding and the dividends? Now, I think if we discuss the uncertainty a bit, that would have, in my mind, led to the taxpayer applying for the ruling. So, of course, these rulings actually have very little detail in them. So you can't. They won't explicitly tell you this is why someone went for the ruling, and they often also don't tell you the reasoning or the interpretation as to how SARS arrived at that position. They just give you this is the ruling that was issued. Okay, so if a loan is used to fund the payment of dividends, I think it's a well-established principle that in that case the interest is not incurred in the production of income, not for purposes of your trade, because it funds a dividend that's paid from profits that's already been earned. Similarly, there's case law to say that if a loan funds the repurchase of shares, the same principle will apply. So in other words, if it's a return of capital through the repurchase of the shares. So it's just another way of doing a distribution. So, and then maybe to put all the pieces together and then see why this ruling was perhaps necessary. There is some case law on refinancing loans to say, but then you can look to the purpose of the original loan. But I think as soon as you introduce funding that was initially obtained through shares that will be refinanced with debt, you introduce a bit of complexity in there to say, but can you still apply that case law? If you're looking at the redemption of the preference share funding, you're now funding a return of capital and preference share or preference dividends. So how far can you look back in a case where you've got this type of funding? Right, so I think what we can get from the ruling is that looking at the overall funding arrangement and the terms that's already been set on day one, it seems that SARS was happy that the intention of the parties, insofar as the purpose of this whole funding arrangement, was that to the extent that the new loan will replace the initial preference share funding, the capital of the preference share funding, the linkage to the original purpose remains in place. And on that basis, that would have to be the basis for SARS to agree that the taxpayer is entitled to the 24J the interest deduction. However, to the extent that the new loan will be used to fund preference dividends, similar to any dividends being funded through loans, this requirement of Section 24J will not be met. So in other words, the interest is not incurred in the production of income. So what can you take home from this ruling if you want to go and think about it a bit further? One is just a reminder again that the interest deductibility depends on the purpose of the loan funding. And I think this ruling is a good reminder that when it comes to refinancing arrangements, especially funding arrangements that involve initially shares and then debt, then you have to be very careful in considering what the purpose of the debt funding would be. Secondly, and although there was no view expressed in this, the ruling is also a good reminder that as soon as you work with and you're looking at redeemable preference shares, you need to be aware of the possibility that Section 8E and 8EA may apply. That's it for today's episode. Just a reminder, as always, nothing in this episode is intended to be tax advice or a replacement for tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.